The three, what I consider to be primary causes of insulin resistance: stress, inflammation, and then insulin itself.
Go have a cup of coffee and then go for a walk. Caffeine mobilizes fat, but now it is your responsibility to take that fat and burn it.
Fat loss is sleep dependent. At the end of the study, the participants lost 55% more body fat when they were able to get 8.5 hours of sleep.
Give a background of how we burn fat in the first place that paints a picture. We'll keep it simple, but we burn fat as a result typically of catecholamines, which are things like adrenaline, norepinephrine, even cortisol. What these are essentially catalysts that say, hey, there's the right amount of stress, that it's time to allow hormone-sensitive lipase to snip off basically the glycerol backbone of a fat molecule. You've got triglyceride, which is fat in its storage form. When there's just enough stress, i.e. exercise, it's enough stress to say, hey, we need to snip off the glycerol backbone. So triglyceride is 3 fatty acid molecules bound to a glycerol molecule. Okay, that's literally fat in its storage form. 3 fatty acids, glycerol backbone. What happens is when you burn fat, hormone-sensitive lipase, which is an enzyme that is triggered by adrenaline or cortisol or epinephrine, its job is to act like a pair of scissors and cut those fatty acid molecules off of the glycerol. So then you are left with 3 fatty acid molecules, and they're floating around, and they go into the mitochondria and get burned. They go into the cell and get burned. So you've got fat mobilization and fat burning, which are 2 different things, right? So that's how that works. And then the glycerol backbone, in case people are wondering where that goes, that eventually just goes to the liver. That goes through what's called gluconeogenesis, can get reconverted back into glucose. It can get broken down and excreted, a number of different things. Now, the reason that I mention that is, remember earlier I talked about the influence of cortisol on fat in a negative way. Well, if we reverse that whole situation, what is the best way that we can inflict just enough stress to get a high amount of concentrated stress so that our body burns more fat? And in this particular case, we could even theorize or speculate that it would be more belly fat based on what we know with the glucocorticoid receptors. And there is some evidence to back this up. However, I can't go on record and say that, hey, this is guaranteed going to only burn belly fat. But the evidence is quite strong against like shorter bursts, interval training. That kind of fat loss means simply because you are inflicting quite a bit of stress, but you're doing it for a short amount of time that your body can actually recover from. The dose makes the poison. If you were to go out and you were to run 100 meter repeats, you would be toast. And your cortisol levels might be elevated to such a degree that it's actually counterproductive, right? Again, I can't say wholeheartedly that's going to make you gain fat. It's probably not, because you burned a lot of calories doing that, but it's a lot of stress on your body. It's about finding, the dose that makes the right poison in this case. And so it's like for high intensity interval training, the evidence has been suggesting that this is really effective, especially with visceral fat, with these that have high glucocorticoid receptors. Now, you get into territory that opens you up for scrutiny when you talk about this, so I'm careful with it. But there's also a lot of evidence that one of the reasons, say, fasting or intermittent fasting works for so many people is because when you go periods of time without eating, you're elevating those stress hormones. But again, it's one of those things where you don't want to be doing it for too long. So there's a large body of evidence. There's also counter bodies of evidence to this too, that suggests that, hey, when you do your training in a fasted state, perhaps you are increasing those catecholamines enough, just a little bit more, that maybe you could squeak a little bit more fat reduction out of it that way. The reality of it is probably just the fact that you're in a deeper deficit at that point. So maybe it's just tapping into the fat a little bit more. And that begs the question of if you lose fat as a whole, you're going to also lose belly fat. So it's hard to specifically spot reduce, but in terms of exercise, your best bet for spot reduction is going to be aiming towards maybe 30-second intervals with a 1 to 2 minute recovery, then a 30-second interval, high intensity and then recovery, high intensity and then recovery.
Mm. All right. You mentioned a couple of really great things there. One of them was how our bodies release that energy, break down those stored fatty acids. And then you mentioned the potential, because it's one thing to get released, it's another thing to get burned, right? So there can be a reabsorption.
Yes.
In some ways. And one of the forms of exercise seen to actually displace some of that released energy, you just mentioned this with the apples examples, is like, you better go for a walk. That can be really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about that. We know high intensity interval training has been a popular term recently. Are we doing it? Maybe not. No. Maybe we haven't really got the memo, but I'm glad that you're bringing this up in the context of like specifically targeting belly fat. But now there's the emergence, even though it's been around a long time, but more really intelligent people in this field are talking about lists. Let's talk about that.
Heck yeah, man. I mean, that's in my jam. I mean, like just a low intensity, steady state, just going for a walk, zone 1, zone 2. I mean, you are in a category where as a percentage of the calories that you're burning a heck of a lot more actual fat calories. Now, you got to be real here. Like if you go out for a run in zone 3 or pushing into zone 4, the absolute amount of calories you're going to burn is going to be more. There's no denying that. Nobody's saying that going for a run for 60 minutes versus walking for 60 minutes, that walking is going to burn more calories. But as a percentage of the fuel utilized, you're using much more fat as a fuel source. The higher you start going up in the intensity, and this is coming from someone that loves my HIIT cardio, that is a runner. I love my high intensity cardio, but I also keep it real because I know that like if I go for an hour and a half walk and handle a bunch of, work calls and Zoom calls on the phone I know that, hey man, I just walked for 90 minutes or 2 hours and I might have burned 600 calories or so, but almost all those calories are coming from fat because I haven't been tapping into a state where I'm going out of what's called beta oxidation. And a good way to kind of put this into a perspective that people might see, like caffeine, for example, caffeine mobilizes fat. That gets people excited because that thinks, if I drink some caffeine, I'm going to be burning fat. Well, caffeine mobilizes the fat, but now it is your responsibility to take that fat and burn it. So the reason that caffeine is an effective fat loss aid is because it does part of the step for you, but it does not absolve you of your duties to still go burn the fat. It did mobilize it, but now it's available to be burned. So that's why I always say, like, yeah, man, like go have a cup of coffee and then go for a walk. Like utilize those lipids that you're circulating. And the reason that I mention that is just because it just illustrates this point, right? So it's like you go for a walk, like the fats are hopefully already somewhat liberated. One of the little hack that people might like too is like there's some pretty solid evidence that sitting in a sauna mobilizes fat very effectively. It can also actually oxidize too because it's just your heart rate goes up. So sitting in a sauna, mobilizing fat, and then going for a walk right after you get out of the sauna. You've got fats mobilized. You've already got them circulating. It's a great time to go and oxidize them. And people ask, well, what would happen if I just went for a run in that case? Well, you'd still burn fat. But the problem is that you also start tapping into your carbohydrate stores. You run the risk of breaking down muscle, which we're now seeing as one of the largest predictive indicators of longevity and also leanness. So you want to do what you can to preserve muscle. It doesn't mean that you never do higher intensity cardio. But the nice thing about walking is, you're preserving muscle. You're very unlikely to break down a bunch of muscle going for a walk unless you are in a very severe deficit. I say first and foremost, whenever you possibly can, start your day with movement, just because that's like you're checking so many boxes there. Like when you start your day with movement, you are putting yourself in a spot where you set the framework for the day. You've also gotten the hard part out of the way. You've also set and sent a message to your family that you are important and that you are taking care of yourself, and it sets the tone for them too. But it also triggers hormones and changes that happen throughout the day that might make you make better choices. So then it makes the second part, which is eating wholesome foods and shopping the perimeter and cooking at home, it makes that part that much easier, right? So that's number 2 is eat at home. Like you've got an amazing cookbook, and that's not just a plug for you, right? It's a real thing. Like whether they pick up your cookbook or another cookbook, cook at home.
They should probably pick up.
They should probably pick up yours. Probably just because you'll kick my ass on the way out if I say it. Like, no, just kidding. But the reality is that just eating at home, like I went through a phase when our kids were young where like we started to eat out more. granted, like we would poke around it and we'd kind of make it work. We'd had our select things, but we were just tired, right? And I felt the connection of our family like break apart, right? But I also felt like it was like, my gosh, I'm like jumping over dollars to save nickels, like figuratively speaking, with my health. Like I'm like do all this stuff. It's so difficult. And when we brought it back to cooking in the house, it was so much easier to maintain my body composition, my thought clearer. Everything just came easy. I slept better. You don't have the mystery things, say what you want, but you know, like MSG keeps me wide awake. Like if I go out to eat and I have MSG, I'm wired because it's an excitotoxin. It's designed to do that. So I feel amped. So that's a huge one there. You know, the other thing is just a simple grocery store trick, which a lot of people know, but that's just like, you know, shop the perimeter, right? The perimeter is where the magic happens. The perimeter is where the limited shelf space, but that's all you really need, right? The stuff on the aisles, that's the garbage. You don't really typically need the the processed stuff. The frozen section's fine because there can be some good stuff in the frozen section, you know. And then, you know, additionally with that, it's like if you're going to prep like one part, the part that's most difficult for you. So this has been a trick of mine for a long time because meal prep is really difficult for people. They say, I don't want to meal prep because it's just too much to take on. Well, when you try to meal prep your carbs, your proteins, your fats, and you're thinking of it like a bodybuilder, it's daunting and it's depressing. But when you say like, okay, what is the hardest thing for me? And typically for people, it's like, it's hardest for me to get the protein in. It's hardest for me to, okay, well then find your favorite cookbook, find whatever, and make up a bunch of just the protein part, because that's the part, everything else you can fill in the gaps easy. Like you can always microwave a sweet potato if you need to. You can always like cook up a bowl of rice. You can always grab an orange or an apple and get your carbs. You can always, it's easy to get those like ancillary things, but the protein is the toughest one. And if you can nail the protein, the rest kind of falls into place, at least from a meal perspective. So, but you know, some people are like, I have no problem getting protein. It's hard for me to find good, healthy carbohydrate sources. Okay, then prep the carbs. So just prep the one thing that is the most difficult for you. It was an utter game changer for me because then it's like, now I go home, I can grab my protein. I've got it. Okay, wife made delicious turkey burgers. Boom, I got 12 of them. So that's no problem. All I need to do is fill in the gaps. But my one most important piece, that protein, is prepped and ready.
I love it. So that's a game changer because a lot of times when we're obsessing about doing meal prep, it's like it's the whole thing and it makes it more complicated. Just even making 2 proteins. What about that? You know, just throwing something in the crock pot, maybe something in the oven, then you got your proteins for the week. You know, that's a great tip because like you said, it is generally much easier to like, we could throw something in the rice cooker or whatever the case might be, but the protein is what tends to take more time in the preparation as well. So that's awesome. Start your day with movement, eat at home. Is there anything else?
Those are the basic ones, man. I mean, we could get into the particulars of, you know, specific, you know, working out and everything like that. I would say if you had to like make a spreadsheet of like how you can kind of like carve up your workouts, I would say 4 days per week of doing some kind of cardiovascular training and 3 days a week of resistance training, and have maybe 2 of them overlap so you have some rest days, right? It's just like, you don't need to do anything crazy, and like find that minimum effective dose, because everyone wants to like go hog wild and like they're like, I'm going to start a workout routine. And it's like, you can get by with 2 days a week of resistance training. Like it's totally fine. Like that minimum effective dose that leaves you feeling fresh, that you can get down and play with the kids. Do things like create your environment, right? We talked, you were on my channel not that long ago, and like we were talking about just walking and stuff. There was a study in, I think it was in Endocrine Reviews, that took a look at like walkable cities versus not walkable cities. Okay, not even looking at the demographics or how much the people walked. It was the mere size of the blocks, were there sidewalks, things like that. It was purely like looking at that blueprint. Walkable cities had a 43% obesity rate, which is still sad, but the non-walkable cities had a 53% obesity rate. So 53 versus 43, and the non-walkable cities had a 30 to 50% higher diabetes risk. Simply by creating the environment that encourages movement, right? Yeah. So little things that you can do, setting your gym shoes out in the morning, having your clothes ready, all these things that would take willpower, right? creating the environment that you establish new habits to walk more. Park further in the parking lot from the grocery store. Like take your phone calls while you're on a walk. You got to create that environment, because your environment dictates everything. Like you talk about the microculture in your home with food and stuff like that. What about the fitness microculture in your mind? Like people say, like when they move to houses that are like on highways where they can't go walk, like they're like, oh, I used to be so healthy until I moved like to a place where I couldn't really walk. My wife and I just bought a different house, and the reason we bought it, outside of it being a great home, was, oh my gosh, the walkability is amazing. This is going to change our life, because right now we're in a spot where we can walk, but can't really walk to anywhere, And so, just not saying everyone has to get up and move, like literally move houses, but that environment is huge.
Yeah, and just to think through that lens as well. And I love that so much, man.
First thing, and this will blow some minds, you cannot have a fat cell grow unless insulin is elevated. It is totally, completely, utterly impossible. Now, I know people want to say, oh, well, calories matter too. They do matter. But if you just take out that one single variable, if you deprive a fat cell of insulin, it cannot grow. 100% full stop. Take this as from a guy who literally grows fat cells in my lab all the time. In a human model, you even see this. If you have a person with type 1 diabetes, they can eat 10,000 calories in a day. And all they do is skip an insulin injection, and they will be as skinny as they want. In fact, this is so well known to that diabetic that it's a known eating disorder. It's more of a hormone disorder. But if they just skip their insulin injection, they'll be as skinny as they want. It's a condition called diabulimia. You only eliminate one single variable, the insulin. They cannot not only grow fat, they can't even hold on to it. So as much as calories matter, and they do, insulin is an absolutely necessary signal to tell the fat cell to grow. And then the calories help fuel that growth. The fat cell starts to get so big, it's like a water balloon that's getting to the point of maximum growth. And if you continue to put water in that balloon, it's going to pop. And so as insulin is high and there's sufficient calories to fuel the growth that the insulin wants the fat cell to undergo, the fat cell starts to tell insulin, you continue to make me grow, but I can't grow anymore, so I'm going to stop listening to you. And so the fat cell that's grown so much becomes insulin resistant to stop growing. So it's a survival mechanism. The poor fat cell, it literally, if it continues to grow, the membrane cannot hold it together, and it will start to fragment and literally start to pop, which will be very unhealthy, cause a lot of inflammation, and it'll be a messy process in that fat tissue to try to clean up. Very unhealthy. So the fat cell becomes insulin resistant to stop further growth. At the same time, as number two, as the fat cell gets bigger and bigger, it starts to get pushed further and further away from the capillaries, which is the main blood vessel where the blood is giving up its oxygen and giving up its nutrition to a cell and taking all of the waste products away from a cell. So if a cell is getting pushed too far from a capillary, it starts to suffocate. The technical term at the level of the cell is it starts to experience hypoxia. It becomes hypoxic. And if the cell doesn't get sufficient oxygen, once again, it will die. It will be a very messy process, and we don't want our cells to die. And the fat cell doesn't want to die. And so it starts leaking out these pro-inflammatory cytokines, this word I mentioned earlier. Some of those cytokines kind of act like a trail of breadcrumbs, where when the capillary senses those breadcrumbs, it can follow them back and start growing a new blood vessel to feed that suffocating fat cell. So the fat cell has another mechanism to ensure its own survival, to correct its hypoxia in this case. But in the process, it is now leaking all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines throughout the entire body, causing what we commonly call subclinical chronic inflammation. So it's not like their inflammation has reached the point of an autoimmune disease or a cold or flu, but it's higher than it should be in someone who's otherwise healthy. And it's all because of the hypertrophic fat cell. And so we have the high insulin and the insulin resistance as the fat cell tries to stop growing. And then we have the inflammation as the fat cell tries to correct its hypoxia, both of which just contribute to insulin resistance throughout the body. So I generally say the fat cell is the first domino to fall. And then when the fat cell becomes insulin resistant, it's promoting this insulin resistance to other tissues like the liver, like the muscle, like the brain, causing fatty liver disease, causing sarcopenia or wasting of the muscle, or causing Alzheimer's or migraines or depression in the case of the brain. The three, what I consider to be primary causes of insulin resistance. And I use the term primary very carefully and deliberately because there are other causes or other contributors of insulin resistance, but they don't meet my standards of being called primary. So there are secondary causes, which for the sake of time, we won't get into. So the primary causes, which are, by my standards, stimuli that are capable of causing insulin resistance on their own, so independent of any other signal, and have also been shown to cause insulin resistance in every biomedical model used in science. So in isolated cells growing in a little petri dish, in laboratory rodents, and in humans. The top of all creation, we go all the way through this, and we can see that these three things will cause insulin resistance. And you just mentioned all of them: stress, inflammation, and then insulin itself. So to the astute listener, they can already start to see a bit of a vicious cycle that can be created here. And in fact, I'll end on that one just as I kind of cover these briefly. So the first one I've mentioned is stress. I define stress by an elevation in the prototypical stress hormones. Those stress hormones are adrenaline and cortisol. In both instances, if you increase either of those hormones, they start to really want to push up blood glucose. That's the one thing they have in common. Cortisol and adrenaline are very, very different hormones. They have practically nothing in common except they really want to increase blood sugar levels. That puts them at odds with insulin, whose most famous job is to lower blood glucose levels. And so the more those stress hormones are creating an upward pressure on the glucose in the blood, well, then the harder insulin has to work to bring it down. Thus, it's no surprise that they cause insulin resistance. I believe the most relevant variable then when it comes to stress is sleep, actually. Even one bad night of sleep can cause quantifiable, demonstrable insulin resistance the next day. Very, very well established. So I focus on sleep as the most relevant variable when it comes to stress-induced insulin resistance. And then just moving on to inflammation, anytime immune signals are up in the body, and this is most obvious with things called cytokines. Cytokines are basically little pro-inflammatory proteins. These little, almost like a pro-inflammatory hormone coming from the white blood cells. Macrophages, for example, are releasing a lot of these cytokines, but a lot of other cells can too, like fat cells when they get too big. They can contribute to this increased inflammation. So anytime inflammation starts to go up, it directly causes insulin resistance throughout the body. And in most instances, I believe that's primarily relevant because of food sensitivity, as well as fat cells that are too big. But then mentioning insulin brings me to the third point, and I end with this point because I do believe it's the most relevant, which is chronically elevated insulin is a cause of insulin resistance. It's in fact the one that I believe is the most powerful and prominent of all of the variables. And this is why my approach generally to resolving insulin resistance starts with this heavy scrutiny of carbohydrates, because we have 3 macronutrients in our diet. I mean, just to put things in perspective for people so they can appreciate how relevant this is, because I could imagine someone listening thinking, well, my insulin isn't elevated all the time. Let me just sort of suggest to the audience just how wrong that view is. At a global level, so we have 3 macronutrients, the 3 things that we eat: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Fat has no effect on insulin. If you and I were to eat a stick of butter and we measured our insulin for 3 hours, I've done this kind of study, not with butter, but with oil, with olive oil. There's no effect on insulin. It's an absolute flat line. If we did the same by eating pure protein, maybe we get a little bit of an effect. Some people have a higher effect. Some people have none. It's going to be, I guess we'll say, little to no effect with pure protein. Then when we eat pure carbohydrate, now, buckle up. Insulin's going to go up by 10 to 20 times, and it's going to be up for about 3 hours. And this is in a healthy, insulin-sensitive person. This is in a college-aged male who's healthy. This is the most metabolically sound person among the entire population. Take a 20-year-old man, that guy can handle all kinds of metabolic abuse and shrug it off. And yet, even in his body, give him about 50 to 75 grams of glucose. It's going to take him 3 hours to clear it. And his insulin would have gone up 10 to 20 times. Now, however, if we take the average adult, which is insulin resistant, it's going to take them up to 5 hours to clear that glucose. And eating 50 grams of glucose, that's pretty easy. And you don't have to bat an eyelash at that. And you already found you've eaten it. Even still, if you take that young, metabolically bulletproof 20-year-old man and give him about 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate, of glucose, which again is not hard to do. It's very easy to drink or eat that much. Even in his body, his insulin is going to be elevated for 10 hours. 10 hours. So now let's just take that information and put it in the context of a standard, I was going to say standard American diet, but the more accurate term is a global diet, because globally, 71% of all calories come from starches and sugars. So they're carbohydrates. 71% of all the calories we eat at a global level. And when you look even sort of more microscopically, we've been told to eat 6 times a day. And so you take someone who's eating 6 times a day, including an evening snack, and 71%-ish of what they're eating is coming from carbohydrate, everything starts to become clear, where the moment a person wakes up, maybe finally when they've woken up, their insulin has finally come down overnight. It's been working hard overnight, and they finally get to a kind of fasted level. And then what do? They immediately spike it by drinking and eating refined, starchy, sugary food. And then the insulin has peaked within about 30, 45 minutes to an hour. Right as it wants to start coming down, maybe 2 hours in, they, of course, have a mid-morning snack and they bump it back up. And then their lunch, then their afternoon snack, supper, evening snack. And so every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin. And depending on what you eat before you go to bed, and let's face it, most people don't eat protein and fat. They want something salty and crunchy or sweet and gooey. So it's going to be some refined carbohydrate coming from a bag or a box with a barcode. And thus they go to bed having just dumped in 100 or 200 more grams of glucose into their bloodstream. And now insulin is elevated for hours while they're sleeping. And one final note on this, if you go to bed hyperglycemic, you activate your sympathetic nervous system. You're actually spiking your adrenaline right before you go to bed. So there are a lot of people who blame their insomnia on their anxiety. And they wonder why they're so hot. Their heart is pounding. They wonder what they're anxious about. You're not anxious about anything. You just spiked your blood sugar, which activates your sympathetic nervous system. So good luck sleeping well. Now you're going to have higher cortisol tomorrow because of your poor night of sleep. And you just keep feeding the metabolic beast. And thus it's little wonder why insulin resistance has become the single most common health disorder worldwide. So the nutrition plan, which absolutely matters most, as much as I'm an advocate of exercise cannot fully make up for a diet that is not up to code. If your diet is really lagging, exercise is only going to help so much. So it's based on the principles that I mentioned earlier, but to kind of wrap all of them up, it's focused on control carbs. So it's a heavy focus on the starches, that the carbohydrates that have the least impact on glucose and insulin. That is the primary motivator here. How can we nourish the body but keep glucose and insulin in check? So it's focusing on, smart sources of carbohydrate, namely fruits and vegetables. So that's the control carb part of it. And then the prioritize protein. And I would say the don't fear fat principles, they really should come together. In our fear of fat, we have pulled the two apart. Because in nature, you never see that. There is no such thing as a protein that exists in nature that comes absent fat. In other words, every protein in nature has fat with it, and that is how we should eat it. If you eat protein in isolation, you don't digest it as well. You minimize the anabolic effect of that protein at muscle. This is all evidenced in human studies. When protein comes with fat, we both digest it better, and it has a stronger anabolic signal than the protein alone. So muscle protein synthesis is stronger when protein is consumed with fat. That's how I advocate people eating it. Whether you want to invoke a divine authority or just nature and evolution, if nature says all proteins come with fat, it stands to reason that the human body is built to bring it in that way. So who are we to defy evolution or God and pull those two things apart? Keep them together. Protein and fat come together. That's how we should eat them. So prioritize protein and don't fear fat. I could say don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. And it's going to have little to no effect on insulin. And speaking of nourishment, that is the nourishment that matters most. I'm not an enemy to carbohydrates, but there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Literally, it does not exist. There are such things as essential amino acids. Thankfully, you'll get them all from any animal source protein. There are such things as essential fats. Thankfully, you'll get them all and more from every fat source, every animal source fat. So I'm an advocate of animal sources in those instances just to ensure you get them all. But again, no essential carb. That doesn't mean don't eat any of them, but it means don't make it the main part of your diet. Why would we make the main part of our diet the very one thing that we don't need? Focus on the things we need. And then the fourth and final principle is fasting. Frequently fast. Find a way to incorporate fasting into your daily plan. But my only point on that is how you end your fast matters more than how long you fast. So the food you eat when your fast is over matters much, much more than how long you fast. And I say that born from abundant experience of seeing people who will go on a 24, 36, 48-hour fast and then binge. Whatever they can shove in their mouth, they shove in their mouths. And then they end up feeling sick. They feel ashamed. They hate to admit this kind of addiction that they're trying to fight with food. And it ends up becoming kind of a form of fasting bulimia where they're binging and purging, but in a sense of fasting. So they only eat one time a day, but man, it's a bunch of garbage. It's gummy bears, it's candy, it's cakes, it's cookies. No, it'd be better to have a shorter fast and keep those macronutrient rules in mind than have a longer fast and throw the macronutrient rules out the window.
Fat loss is sleep dependent. Please hear me. This is one of the biggest takeaways of the day and of your lifetime. Fat loss is sleep dependent. A randomized crossover study conducted by scientists at the University of Chicago found that when test subjects were placed on the same diet in the same controlled conditions, the amount of sleep they got dramatically affected fat loss. In one condition, the test subjects were allowed to get 8.5 hours of sleep nightly for 2 weeks. In another condition, they were sleep deprived and restricted to just 5.5 hours of sleep nightly for 2 weeks. Now, keep in mind, they're all on the same calorie restricted diet in the same conditions. And after compiling the data, at the end of the study, the participants lost 55% more body fat when they were able to get 8.5 hours of sleep. I just want you to think about how remarkable that is. When they increased the amount of sleep that they're getting, we're not talking about activity. We're not talking about eating. We're talking about sleep. They lost 55% more body fat. And not only that, the study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine reveals something shocking to do with muscle. When the participants were sleep deprived, their bodies began burning off their muscle for fuel at a faster rate. The participants' loss of fat-free mass, including their muscle, increased by 60% when they were sleep deprived. This was accompanied by what the researchers called neuroendocrine adaptation that shifted their body away from burning fat for fuel and turning it towards burning their muscle for fuel. This is what's happening when we're depriving ourselves of sleep. And this should be well known. If our goal is to burn fat and build muscle, the fastest way to do the opposite, to not do those things, is to sleep deprive ourselves. And so truly, fat loss is sleep dependent, and so is building and protecting our muscle. And I really want to emphasize that today. And so we've got to keep all of these things in perspective for ourselves, be gentle with ourselves, look at how we can add these things into our life without overstressing, overdoing it. But we need to have a life that is built around giving ourselves healthy movement inputs and allowing ourselves to rest. Today, more than ever, we've got so much stuff that is siphoning our energy and our attention. But thinking about how much time we waste with all these television apps, with all the social media and things like that, we can construct a life to where we're getting in an hour of movement a day. We can do that. There's so many paths to that goal, and allotting adequate time for us to sleep. And in this domain, unfortunately, something that we just, as a species, every other species sleeps. Like it's not a thing. There isn't like a hyena walking around like, you know what? I got insomnia, bruh. All right. It's us. It's us. And this is because we have a society that is constructed to fight against us sleeping. And so this is why I focus my first major book. And I'm very grateful to say that it is an international bestseller. It is now translated it's getting close to 30 different countries and languages. And that book is called Sleep Smarter. And there's 21 clinically proven strategies, all backed by science, to improve your sleep. Not just your sleep duration, but the quality of your sleep. Because it's really sleep smarter, not sleep more. For some people, they do need more, but it's really optimizing the minutes that we're getting. And so we've talked many times here on the Model Health Show about improving your sleep quality, and we'll definitely put a couple of links to some of those episodes for you here to dive into. If you really today, you just like really got it and it clicked, like I really need to focus on improving my sleep quality. I'm messing myself up. I'm making my life harder. I'm making my fitness harder because I'm not getting the sleep that my body needs. And so I really want you to keep this in mind, that fat loss is sleep dependent. A couple of quick tips. Number one, we want to be mindful of the number one sleep deterrent today in our modern world, which is our technology. Our technology is sucking the sleep right out of us. All right. And we've got to keep that in mind because researchers have affirmed again and again, one of the most recent studies on this, that being on our devices in the evening, that light spectrum beaming into our eyes is affecting every cell in our bodies. Our vision is a place of data input, but it's not just our eyes, by the way. Our skin picks up data. Our skin has photoreceptors, is picking up information. Our body is constantly trying to figure out what time of day it is so that it knows the appropriate hormones and neurotransmitters and cellular activity overall to do. So we know that number one, the light coming from our devices suppresses our melatonin production and increases our body's production of cortisol, specifically when we're on them in the evening. It's not the same response when we're on them in the daytime because, again, our bodies are synced up with the 24-hour solar day. We're connected to all of life here in this universe. We're a part of it. But this stuff is new. We have not adapted to this exposure, and it really disrupts what's happening with our hormones, in particular what's happening with melatonin, which is a huge driver of our sleep quality. All right, so give yourself a screen curfew to the best of your ability. If you're going right from your device to bed every night, it's probably not a good idea. So start with a 30-minute sleep curfew. Give yourself a little bit of time. Of course, you've got blue light blocking glasses and all those cool things, but some screen-free time period is ideal. 30 minutes, an hour if you want to get crazy, all right? But you got to fill that time with something that you really value and enjoy as well. This could be, reading a book. They still exist. This could be listening to a podcast or an audio book. You don't got to stare into a screen to do those things. This could be talking to your significant other. This could be a little, mobility work, a little massage, working on with some mobility tools. My friend, Dr. Kelly Starrett, this is one of his favorite things to do in the evening. Do a little rolling, the little crossbar, a little foam rolling, and you get some kind of parasympathetic activation there as well. This could be not just self-massage, but massaging or getting a massage from somebody else, all right, which could lead into some... Now, it doesn't have to. Sometimes a massage is just a massage, all right, for the lovers out there. But, but human touch, we need that. We need that. All right. And so another tip is to optimize that sleep environment. And so again, we've talked a lot about this on multiple episodes of the show. This light, especially, it's being dubbed the light pollution. And so if you've got a lot of external lights out there outside your window, making sure you're getting some blackout curtains. And if you still, for your own psychological feeling of safety and comfort, and you want something that is, a light in the room itself, something that is a hue or a spectrum of light that we evolved with, right? So something of the more orangish, reddish hue, lower light is going to be ideal. All right. And get the environment cool as well. We sleep better when the environment is cool. We got a lot of science on that too. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here. Now, there are two types of hypertrophy. One type is called myofibrillar hypertrophy. Now, that is the growth of the muscle parts. The other type of hypertrophy is called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.